That's, yeah, sometimes I just listen to the music we do in here and I just smile. I just love the music sometimes, almost all the time that we come up with when we meet and come up with some of these songs. And I didn't know that about Sting. Where'd Brad go? Oh, there. Yeah, I didn't know that about Sting. That makes the Bumblebee thing, yeah. So good to have everybody here this morning. Summer hasn't dampened us too much. I hope you all have been enjoying the summer. I had 2 weeks off. Well, not really off. I was 2 weeks away. And July has been kind of continue to be a crazy month for me because of prior engagements and whatnot that have me away. And I want to tell you a little bit about that in just a second. But first, I wanted to just kind of draw some attention to someone here. We have Lori Dreyer. Some of you all remember Lori and her partner Shelly is here. They've been in Seattle, in that area, for a long time. But y'all remember Lori, who used to sing with the 1111 band way back. And so they've been back in the area now, and so we can't wait to maybe hopefully see more. Yeah. So we're good to have you guys. The title here, I don't know if it's in the bulletin, or I don't know that it made the power. Oh, it didn't. Yeah, the title in your bulletin says, "Looking for the One No." And maybe that's more appropriate. We'll see by the end of this message if that's not the more appropriate thing. I was 2 weeks in Southwestern University. Somebody asked me how it was going because I mentioned to you last week or 2 weeks ago that I was a little bit anxious because I am claustrophobic and it looked like we will all be staying in the dorm rooms by ourselves and whatnot. And in fact, they had one student apartment available that was right on the edge of the campus at Southwestern University. One student apartment. Taylor Davis, who's the choir music director here at the church, was also involved in this conference working with high school students down at Southwestern. And so the two of us shared this apartment, which was nice. 2 bedrooms, a little central room. Then he left about 5 days into the conference. And so I was all by myself on the edge of this campus in this massive sort of collection of apartments with nobody else around. That was fine. I'm a brave boy. But on the third night that Taylor had left, there was knocking on the walls. And I'm still okay. But the next night, there was knocking on the door. Now, my bedroom backs up to the window that looks out onto the porch and looks at the door. So I would just creak open the blind enough to make sure I could see out there, and I'd hear the knocking, and I'd look out there, and there was nothing. And the next day, I reported it to the director of this conference, and I said, I'm okay. I'm not sure I want to come to a dorm room, but there's knocking in my apartment, and I don't know what it is. And they said, well, it's like a vent system. And I said, no, it's on the front door. Knock, knock, knock. There's someone at my door. You know that song. Anyway, so there, and I'm thinking, I don't know what this is. And again, on the next night, it gets just bold, like in my face. It's 2 a.m. It's awakened me. And I walk to the peephole while the knocking is going on. And I look through the peephole, and there is nobody there. But the door is knocking. I'm thinking, yeah, that's right. I'm thinking my kid's book, right? Yeah. I'm thinking this is just weird. And so I then go back to the window and take a braver look and just pull up the whole blinds and look out. There's still nothing there, but I look on the ground and there's a bullfrog at the door, facing it with his nose. And every now and then just bumping into the door. I guess doing one of two things. Either thinking that I'm a princess. More than likely was wanting the bugs that were gathering around from the light. But it was 4 nights into this, and I finally discover who it was. And Jeremiah the bullfrog. Yeah. And I took a picture of it, too, just so I didn't really think about it. Somebody asked me right before service. I would have actually given you a slide of it. But, yep, that's what it was, bullfrog. This verse, I want to read this passage again for you. I think this is an amazing passage. I don't know what it said to you as you were listening to it, but I heard several things the first time I read it and thought, well, I'm going to just speak on it. Finally, beloved, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is pleasing, whatever is commendable, if there is any excellence, if there is anything worthy of praise, think about these things. Keep doing these things until you have learned and received and heard and seen in me, and the God of peace will be with you. And then the second part of it, I've learned to be content with whatever I have. I know what it is to have little. I know what it is to have plenty. In all circumstances, I've learned the secret of being well fed and of going hungry and of having plenty and of being in need. But I can do all things through God who strengthens me. I was reading this verse, and someone earlier last week had mentioned something about finally finding the place where they ought to be. Finally being that place where they felt like God was calling them to be. And they kind of smiled and they said, I wasn't sure at first, but then people would say, it just resonates. Your face resonates, and everything just seems to resonate. And so I started thinking about this whole idea of resonating and what that means. And the more I read this verse, the more I thought, well, that's kind of what this verse is really about. This verse is really about resonating. So Brad and I started thinking about music that speaks to that, and then he came up with this Sting song and said, this tritone at the beginning. And isn't it interesting that the early church didn't want impure tones because it represented evil? So I'm giving you a little quick physics class, and if you're a scientist or even if you did well in physics, you're going to probably you'll shoot holes all in my discussion, but I'm going to just give you a quick little physics class on resonance because I had to go look it all up and figure out how this thing really works. But basically every object, animate, inanimate, every object has a natural frequency. When struck or when vibrated, every object has a natural frequency. Now, when that object and frequency interact with another one that is dissonant or is disharmonious, as Brad was mentioning with the tritone, then you get this sort of dissonant sound, which in a lot of times can be very uncomfortable. I mean, dissonance has come to be somewhat of a fairly common Western technique in music. And if you think about it, it's a great narrative technique because dissonance is just like any obstacle in life. It just creates this tension. But the idea, of course, is that eventually you're going to get to a resolution, or in musical terms, to consonance, where things are back in harmony. If we're sitting there listening to someone sing for a while and they never quite get there, it becomes a painful experience. And then we're no longer experiencing the note, now we're kind of experiencing sympathy. Maybe even empathy, but more sort of a sympathetic tension that we now experience because we're just hoping it will come to an end. Dissonance can be a very great teaching tool, but it also is it's an uncomfortable thing. Now, here's the curious thing here. Dissonance is basically the clashing of two frequencies into a disharmonious moment. But here's the interesting thing as I was starting to look at this whole thing. You know the term cognitive dissonance. You're familiar with that idea, cognitive dissonance. Well, we all experience dissonance in life. Dissonance is when we have two ideas that compete with each other. We find ourselves in a working situation, but then suddenly we have an ethical problem with it. But then what we do is we adjust our thinking so that we can be harmonious with where we are. We call that cognitive dissonance. We cognitively reorient ourselves. Sometimes we do that in a way that's we sort of make up how we think about things. We change how we think about things in order to make it stable. Sometimes we have a little more of a rational response in which we actually just change what we're doing because it doesn't jive with our actual deeper beliefs. There's a lot of different ways of dealing with cognitive dissonance. I should get Mitzi up here to explain, being the therapist that she is, but I did take an intro class in psychology, so I think I'm remembering most of it. Yeah. That's right, yeah. So you all listen to me, you'll be well after this. Huh? So this idea of dissonance is something we experience both emotionally, personally, as well as spiritually, as well as physically. So for me, it got to thinking in terms of, well then, what is resonance? Because I think that's what this verse is really about. Resonance. That idea of when we resonate with one another. And the typical physics definition is resonance is when frequencies encounter one another and it creates an amplitude of sound. So in a single, for example, Lynn was ringing the bowl. And Lynn, would you do it one more time, ring this crystal bowl? It has one primary frequency. But no, keep vibrating it, I'm sorry, yeah. But the more he vibrates it, the more amplitude is focused on that vibration, on that frequency, until at some point it resonates. If this room were solid stone and floor, depending on some of the other frequencies in here, this room might actually resonate with that. It's not too much of a leap to think about how this works for people, is it? To think about how this works in our places of work or in our communities, wherever we find ourselves. This idea of resonating is something that we sort of, on one hand, take for granted, and on the other hand, we have a hard time practicing it. I think this verse speaks to that. When I was in Austin, I was in Georgetown, but then I went down to Austin on Sunday. I heard about this church, and I didn't know about this. When Charles was here, he may have actually mentioned this church to me. I didn't know about it particularly. I got online and was looking around at churches, and we were doing a mission trip to Austin Sunday morning, but then I saw this church, Trinity United Methodist Church in Austin. And I read their website, and I thought, oh my gosh, this is 1111. I didn't realize there was another 1111 anywhere. But it's been around for 25 years or more. It's a congregation in the Methodist Church, in the conference, in the Southwest Texas Conference. Turns out that the senior pastor there, Sid Hall, also good friends with our senior pastor here, Tim Brewster. And we visited afterwards a little bit. So I went to the service. It's in the round. Has a larger sanctuary than this space, but actually a smaller congregation. Maybe about 90 to 120. And very casually dressed. They had one of these singing crystal bowls in the back that they used for a couple of times throughout the service. They sang songs. They got up and they moved around a bit. They greeted each other quite often. They shared stories. It was a very warm, engaging, creation, spirituality-centered place. And I looked about myself and I saw all of these different socioeconomic representations, different ethnic groups, different sexual orientation group. Everybody was there. Now you're going, well, it was Austin. Yeah, it was, and it is. But there was something else there, and that's what brought me to Trinity, was this idea that 25 years ago they spoke, they listened, they heard a need that was coming out of the community in which they were placed, and they responded to it. Now, as I talked to Sid, it wasn't an easy response. It used to be Hyde Park Methodist. It used to have 200 or 300 people in the worship service. But that community changed like communities do. And as it did, people were having difficulty resonating. One of the challenges for us sometimes, I think, is that when we experience newness and we experience changes, we're not sure how to deal with it. There's a lot of disharmony, a lot of dissonance that gets created. But when you realize why that's being created, what's the cause? What's the source of that dissonance? Well, we talk about it all the time. It was fear. It's always, almost always, just fear. At the beginning of this conference that I was at Southwestern, my focus was on the Storytelling Arts Village. We had several different arts villages in the midst of these kids learning from theologians, different perspectives, everything from the right wing to the left wing and everything in between, having worship services throughout the day, design. It was basically a hands-on introduction to sort of seminary training for these kids who might be looking at a vocation in the church. About 50 kids, all seniors and a few juniors. At the beginning, Ken Miedema was there for a week. Y'all remember Ken Miedema and how powerful Ken can translate and reform a story that he hears and translate it in musical form in a way that brings insight and empowerment. And he did that for these kids the first week. Usually it's the second week. Now, think about it. These kids were in small groups, and I opened up the arena for sharing stories. The stories that were told would tear you at your soul. I was shocked at the kinds of stories these kids were experiencing. Some of the challenges that these kids were going through. Average, everyday kids. Average, everyday families. Later on in the second week, when we were talking about working with homeless people under the bridge in Austin and where our mission is, one of the kids looked up and said smilingly and insightfully said, "We have our mission here too." And they kind of all smiled because they'd heard each other's stories. At the end of the 2 weeks, when we talked about we're going from this community where we've come together and where we've shared stories and where we've suddenly resonated with one another because we've discovered your story is really not that different from mine. In fact, I'm learning a lot more about myself from your story. They were pulling all of these things together, but now they were going to have to leave, go back to where they didn't really feel that sense of trust. And we were all giving them instructions on how to deal with this. What you can do to sort of help to transition. And one kid said, "Is it okay to be afraid?" You could just feel everybody's guts just wrenching at that moment. Every one of us could feel that. And then someone echoed that James Taylor line. I was about to. From that song that I've done here before, A Secret of Life. And they said, it's okay to be afraid, but don't let that get in your way. Sometimes in a church, it gets in the way. Sometimes in a church, people forget about what it means to try to stay connected and what it means to be open and vulnerable, that where God is in the midst of that. And because of that, things fall apart. But if enough people stay focused and connected and open, and we'll get to how that works. But when that happened at Hyde Park United Methodist, Hyde Park became Trinity United Methodist. And it became one of the earliest churches in any of the conferences that I know of to become a reconciling church. A church that is openly affirming of anyone's sexual orientation, as well as anyone's socioeconomic background, where the policy of open doors, open heart, like we sometimes remember, that's who we are, is followed underneath it by unconditionally. Well, I hope the Methodist Church can get there eventually. But I wanted to be present there because I wanted to see how this community resonated. How did that happen? How can it happen? So, I began thinking about this whole idea of resonating, and I was talking to someone about their job, and it occurred to me why resonating is not a fixed frequency. Even though this is a great illustration of how it works. The reality is, as an E string, I could play an E string, but if I pull that E string out of tune a little bit, it's still an E string. But it needs to be tuned up. And if you're playing in a different key, I'll still take my E string and I'll tune it up to whatever that key is. It's still an E string. Resonating and resonance, it's not fixed, it's improvisational. And the key to how that happens is in our scripture verse, where Paul says, I have learned to be content with what I have, with what I didn't have, to have plenty, to have little, to being well-fed, to going hungry. I can do all things through God who strengthens me. Now, I don't want to leave that there because that is cliche. Because we'll take that with us, walk out the door, and as Harry Chapin used to say, you won't do nothing with it. So just leave it here and go. Because cognitive dissonance is easy for us, and we will plug that in anytime we're uncomfortable and not even know it. I think there's something else he was saying there. So I was talking to my friend, and they were telling me, they were saying, you know what, I just can't stand those people. They were talking about their job. You know, they're always being so bossy and pushy. I will do this, and then the next thing you know is they've taken what I've done, and even though they say that they're working with me and that we're all in this together, they will take and change what I just did. I don't understand why. I'm just losing it, getting more and more upset. Is this resonating with anybody? In your workplace, with your family, it just doesn't seem like anybody's going to pay attention. They ask for your help, and then they don't use it, or they'll contradict it. And the more I was talking to this person, the more I got to realizing this. They were focusing all of this energy. And I stopped and I said, you're not happy, are you? But no, I mean, it wasn't the obvious, like, well, duh. You would say, I'm not happy. No, no, no. I mean, you're not happy. You're not really experiencing any joy. And it just stopped that person suddenly. Just right there in their tracks, just stopped them. It was like he had no idea what that was. He'd not seen that in a long time. That's what he thought was there at the job when he first took the job, but it hadn't been there in a long time. And I said, in reality, it feels like there's something there for you, but you're spending so much of your energy on how upset you are without realizing that the hole is still there, and all of this energy's got to go somewhere, so now it's just going out. I think sometimes when our energy, when our passions are not focused in the direction they should be, they become destructive. Not necessarily towards others, but towards ourselves as well. If that person, if he could find a way to get back in tune with something that gives him joy, I would bet, hands down, he would care less what those other people were doing. When we're happy, people around us are happy. But the key is how to get in tune with that. And I don't want to suggest that it's this whole law of attraction thing. There may be something to law of attraction, to The Secret. There may be something to all of that. But it smacks so much of the gospel of prosperity to me that I just don't even like going there. People will tell us, I'll hear these preachers, I'll hear these motivational speakers, God has this place for you. Your destiny is waiting for you. And if you plug into that, once you get there, just wait, be patient. God has this place for you. And I'm thinking, okay, well, I've just been reading through the Bible, and I think it's pretty obvious where my place is. I'm supposed to be caring for other people. I'm supposed to be reaching out. I'm supposed to be paying attention. I'm supposed to be trying to be in tune with one another. Seems pretty straightforward. I think the thing that was interesting about the experience that preceded the, we need to finish up here. The thing that preceded the experience at Trinity United Methodist was we went to the place called Church Under the Bridge. And I'll wrap it up here with a couple of quick thoughts. Church Under the Bridge is every Sunday, a crowd gathers under the bridge, a lot of folks who are displaced, a lot of folks who are homeless, a lot of folks who come as volunteers. It's still very interesting. Hundreds of people will gather. There's a band playing. It's typically a fairly traditional gospel message. There's always food. People are scattered all about, pockets, isolated. I'll look over here and I'll see the volunteers who are working the food tables. They're kind of hanging out together. I'll look over here and I'll see folks who kind of came just to kind of mingle, but they're still kind of hanging together. Fear is a powerful dissonant, it's just powerful. This sense of I don't know what to do. But then I sat down next to this guy who was in a wheelchair. He was a vet from the Vietnam War. And there was a kid sitting next to him. And he was one of the youth that had come to their conference, but didn't know what to say. So we just sat down, and I just broke the ice open. I just started asking some questions. Now, what I knew about this kid was that his father had been an alcoholic, but he was in recovery. The more our story opened up, the more this gentleman in the wheelchair, began to talk about his struggles with alcoholism, and that he was on the mend right now, and he was living at the mission. But as those stories got shared, you could see this kid's face light up. It wasn't smiling, he was resonating. He was connecting to that part of him which understood what this guy was going through in some way. And where it would go from there, I don't know, but the one thing I do know is that it opened him up to the possibility of a little bit of God's kingdom breaking through right there. So I want to suggest something to you. I want to suggest that resonance has to do with our willingness to tune up. One of the cool things that happened at this conference was that nobody knew this, but kids all brought instruments. We didn't even think it was a singing group because they normally indicate that in their registration. Nobody indicated they were musicians, and 10 instruments showed up. Ukuleles, guitars, a clarinet, an oboe. Nobody said anything. All these instruments showed up. The whole 2 weeks was spent playing music, some of which people knew and a lot of which they didn't know. So you heard this constant phrase. It was so neat. It was so awesome. You'd hear this phrase, people standing around with their guitars. Think about it. You got 10 guitars. What a nightmare, right? I mean, you got 10 guitars and it's going like, it's going to be jazz. Lucky if we ever get in tune. But here's what would happen. It became sort of the common phrase. People would come and lean into each other and say, oh, we're out of tune. And then one would say, well, here, let me tune to you. And they would tune up. And then the thing would get passed over there, and they said, well, let's tune to you. And pretty soon, before you know it, we were all tuned to each other. And it wasn't like who's got a tuner. It was just, let me tune to where you are. What a great image. I think that's what it's all about. That song y'all sang last week, one of our favorite songs here, and we're going to do it often, I think, in the future. We hadn't done it much, but now, which one am I thinking? We sang the hymn we sang last week. Thank you. Come thou fount of every blessing. I went, phew, blank. The line in there, which is so wonderful, tuned my heart to sing thy praise. Tune my heart. This last line, I have learned to be content. All circumstances, the secret of being well fed. I can do all things through God who strengthens me. Do you know what the root Old English and Germanic word is to strengthen? It's string. Tune my heart to thee. Maybe we find our strength in God and our willingness to tune to one another. Amen.